My father wasn't who I thought he was. Family secrets and DNA twists, Reddit stories. They say family is everything, that blood binds tighter than time, tighter than wounds, tighter than truth. But what if the truth was the only thing left to bind us, and even that had been kept buried so long it began to rot? Before I tell you what happened, you need to understand the house I grew up in. It wasn't a mansion, nor a hovel, but a quiet, unremarkable two-story in a cul-de-sac where hedges were trimmed with military precision and neighbors knew just enough about each other to wave from the driveway without asking real questions. My mother, Evelyn, was a school librarian, the kind who always smelled faintly of lavender and old pages. My father, George, worked as a claims adjuster, a man of routine and radio silence, who read the newspaper in full every morning before speaking a single word. Then there was my sister, Abigail, 2 years older, born with an uncanny ability to vanish in plain sight. She wasn't shy, just elsewhere, always scribbling in journals she never let me read. And me. I was the youngest, the observer, the one who learned early on that family wasn't what you saw at dinner, but what you noticed in the spaces between silences. Our dinners were mechanical, plates passed, peas pushed, the occasional cough or clink of fork. We were a family, certainly, but of what sort I could never quite name. Birthdays were the rare exceptions, days when we pretended warmth was native to us. My mother made confetti cupcakes, my father gave stiff, envelope-contained cards with $20 bills, and Abigail handed over handmade things, drawings, collages, pressed flowers. Oddly impersonal for someone who knew so many details about the rest of us. But those rituals, mundane as they were, stitched a pattern into my memory that would one day come undone with a single card. I remember my 15th birthday the clearest, not because of the party. We never had parties, but because that year was the first I noticed the tremble in my father's hand as he passed me the envelope. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but I'd seen him pour boiling water without flinching. Something about that card made him hesitate. I opened it anyway. "Happy birthday, son. Proud of you, Dad." Same words as always, same tidy signature. But the handwriting, it wasn't his. I didn't say anything then. Why would I? Who questions love when it's handed to you, even if it feels forged? But that card, like a splinter, never quite stopped itching at the back of my mind. Years passed. I went to college out of state, stayed gone during summers, found excuses not to return for Thanksgiving. Abigail moved to another city, got into environmental work, something with rivers and trees. My parents aged into stillness. Their world shrank to crossword puzzles and muted television. Then came the phone call. My father had died suddenly, heart failure, no warning, no hospital goodbyes. I returned, not out of grief exactly, but obligation, like pulling weeds from a neglected garden you didn't ask to inherit. My mother was hollowed out, but composed. Abigail arrived 2 days later, looking like she'd been living in a tent with wolves. Sun-scorched, sharp-eyed, distracted. We didn't hug. We never had. The funeral was brief, practical. Dad would have wanted it that way. A few people from his office came, said perfunctory things, and left before the final hymn. The house, afterward, felt unnaturally still, like the furniture was holding its breath. We were supposed to sort his things. Bank records, keys, old sweaters that still smelled of aftershave. My mother retreated to her room after lunch, leaving Abigail and me in the study. The desk, once a fortress of Dad's order, now seemed vulnerable, exposed. We went through drawers in silence. Pens, receipts, paper clips. And then, at the back of the lowest drawer, a stack of birthday cards. My birthday cards. All of them. Even ones I thought I'd thrown away. Abigail paused, holding one up. "He kept these," she murmured, but I was too focused on the one from my 15th year. The handwriting? I took it, turned it over, felt the paper as if the truth might bleed through the fibers. I held it next to a different card from another year. The discrepancy was clear as a confession. "This wasn't him," I said, more to myself than to her. Abigail looked at me sharply, then away. "No," she said quietly. "It wasn't. The room felt colder suddenly, the silence turning from passive to complicit. I asked her what she meant. She didn't answer. Just returned to the drawer, pulling out a small, red notebook I hadn't noticed before. She flipped it open, scanned the first page, then handed it to me. "You should read this." The handwriting inside was my mother's. The entries were dated, sporadic, and written with a careful hand. The first few were benign notes about groceries, appointments, her thoughts on books. But then came a line that cleaved the air like lightning. "George agreed to the arrangement today. For the boys' sake, I pray it's the right decision." The boys, plural. I kept reading. The entries grew heavier, each one hinting at a truth just out of reach. "He looks so much like Thomas did at that age. I can't tell if that's a comfort or a curse." Thomas? I didn't know a Thomas. I looked at Abigail, who was now sitting with her head in her hands. "What is this?" I demanded. She didn't lift her head, just said, "He wasn't your father." The words hit like a stone to the ribs. I laughed reflexively, like I hadn't heard her correctly. "What are you talking about?" "Mom had an affair, a long time ago, with someone she met at the library conference. His name was Thomas. You were born a year later." Dad knew. They both decided to raise you like nothing had happened. They thought it was better. Simpler. Simpler. I felt like the room was spinning. My identity, my childhood, every word my father had ever spoken, or hadn't spoken, suddenly twisted into something unrecognizable. And Abigail knew. She'd always known. That's why her gifts felt impersonal. That's why she'd been distant, protective in a way I didn't understand. Because she carried a truth I hadn't been trusted with. I couldn't breathe. I left the room, walked until I reached the backyard where the hydrangeas were blooming too brightly. I sat on the porch step and tried to piece myself together. If he wasn't my father, who was I mourning? If my mother lied about something so fundamental, what else was a fabrication? But the worst part wasn't the lie. It was how good it had felt to believe it. Even the stiffness, the silences, the envelopes, it had all been part of something I thought was love. Maybe it was. Maybe love isn't warm or easy. Maybe it's quiet and compromised and chosen daily, even when it hurts. But if that were true, then why did I feel so completely alone now? Behind me, the screen door creaked. I didn't turn. Abigail sat beside me. She didn't say anything, just placed another card on my lap. It was unopened, sealed, dated the day before Dad died. My name was written on the front, in his handwriting. I didn't open the card right away. For minutes, maybe more, I just held it, tracing the edges with my thumb as if the weight of the truth inside might seep out through the paper. It was absurd, but I was afraid. Afraid that whatever message waited for me would finalize something I hadn't yet accepted, that it would be a period at the end of a sentence I wasn't ready to read. My father, or the man I had called my father, was gone. The one person who might have explained everything was now sealed away underground, just like the lies he'd carried. Still, the envelope felt alive in my hands. A goodbye, a confession, or maybe just another birthday message caught in a cruel twist of timing. I stood, walked out to the far corner of the backyard where the rusted swing set leaned like an old memory. That was where I used to play as a kid, always under his watchful eye from the kitchen window. I sat in the grass, inhaled the scent of spring weeds, and finally opened the card. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, not rushed, not shaky at the top. It said simply, "For when you're ready." Then, a paragraph below, penned in a darker blue ink than usual. "I've written and rewritten this more times than I can count. If you're reading this, it means I didn't get to say it in person. There are things I should have told you long ago, things I've kept inside for what I thought were the right reasons. But I see now that silence is just another kind of lie. So here it is, you are my son, in every way that matters. I chose you. I loved you, even when I didn't show it right, especially then. Your mother made a mistake, a moment, a person. She told me the truth, and I made the decision to raise you as my own. Not because I was noble, not out of pity, but because the first time I held you, I felt something I didn't know I was capable of. Maybe I was trying to prove something to myself. Maybe I wanted to believe blood didn't matter, and most days it didn't. You were mine. You always were. But I know you'll feel betrayed, and I'm sorry for that. I am. Just know if I failed you, and I know I did, in ways small and large, it was never because I didn't care. It was because I was afraid. I hope one day you'll understand. That was all. No signature. Just a clean end, as though he knew he'd already said too much. I didn't cry. Not then. Something colder had taken hold. I folded the card back into its envelope and tucked it into my jacket. The sky had clouded over, casting the yard in a dull, expressionless gray. The grass seemed longer than I remembered, the swing rusted stiff. I walked back inside to find Abigail still in the study, flipping through the red notebook like it might suddenly rearrange its meaning. She looked up, eyes searching mine. I said nothing, just showed her the card. She nodded, slow and grave, and whispered, "So he did know." As if that changed anything, as if it made any of it better. The days that followed blurred into one long march of logistics. The lawyer came, papers were signed, accounts dissolved, belongings sorted. My mother barely left her room, emerging only to sip tea and stare out windows like she was waiting for someone who'd long since disappeared. I avoided her, not out of anger, though that simmered quietly, but because I didn't know what I'd say if she asked me to forgive her. I wasn't ready to decide whether forgiveness was even an option. On the third night, Abigail and I sat in the living room surrounded by half-packed boxes. She held one of Dad's old ties, twisting it in her lap like a rosary. "I always wondered if he resented you," she said, not looking at me. "But he didn't. Not really. I think he envied you more than anything. You were innocent, untouched by all the things that broke him." That word, envy, felt like a bruise I hadn't noticed. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I asked. She sighed. "Because I thought you deserved the illusion. And maybe because I was afraid, too, of what it would mean for us. The words sat between us like glass. Were we still siblings if we no longer shared a father? Legally, maybe. Emotionally, I didn't know. And maybe that uncertainty was the cruelest part of all. The next morning, I found my mother at the kitchen table, staring into a mug gone cold. I hadn't seen her this lucid in days. "You read it?" she asked. No preamble, no excuse, just a mother, too tired to pretend anymore. "Yes," I said. Her hands trembled just like his had. "Never meant to hurt you," she said. "One, I found out I was pregnant. I panicked. Thomas was long gone. Your father, George, he offered to stay, to make it work. Said we could keep it between us. I thought we could bury the truth. Pretend hard enough, and it might become real." She looked up at me, and her eyes were red-rimmed, puffy. "But it was real. You were real. And he loved you in a way I never expected. Even when we drifted, even when I knew he couldn't look at me without remembering what I'd done, he never took that out on you. He protected you from it all." I wanted to scream, or laugh, or throw something. But instead, I said, "And what about Thomas? Did he know?" She blinked. "I never told him. I couldn't. He was a storm that passed through and left too much wreckage behind. He never would have stayed." I nodded. Not out of agreement, but because I didn't know what else to do. Later that day, I found myself walking through town. I passed the library where my mother had worked, the park where we used to picnic, the little bookstore where I'd bought my first novel. The whole town felt different, like I'd been seeing it through frosted glass, and now the fog had lifted. I wandered until my feet led me to a nursing home on the edge of town. I didn't know why at first, but then I remembered something. Something Abigail had said offhand years ago, about Thomas being from nearby, about him having parents who'd stayed when he left. The front desk attendant was kind, too kind, and within minutes, I was sitting in a quiet room across from a woman named Margaret Harrow, Thomas's mother. My grandmother, if the truth held weight. She was frail but alert, her eyes sharp behind thick lenses. "You're Evelyn's boy, aren't you?" she said, not even waiting for an introduction. My heart thudded. "Wes," I replied. I think Thomas might have been my father." She studied me, then smiled, faint but unmistakable. "We always wondered. Your mother stopped coming by. We assumed something had happened. But when I saw you in the paper, at George's funeral, I knew. You have his eyes." I didn't know what to feel. Relief, anger, grief. She reached for my hand, and her skin was paper. Then, he was troubled Thomas, always chasing something he couldn't name. "But if he'd known you existed, he would have come back. I'm sure of that." I didn't believe her. Not really. But I let her say it, because sometimes kindness needs space, even if it's rooted in fiction. I left the nursing home with more questions than answers. Who was Thomas really? Would I have turned out differently if I'd known? Was blood enough to shift the path of a life already lived? I returned to the house that night to find Abigail in the attic, surrounded by photo albums and dusty boxes. "There's something you should see," she said, holding out an envelope yellowed with age. Inside was a picture. Our mother, younger, laughing, leaning into a man I didn't recognize. He had my jawline, my posture. It was unmistakable. On the back, in faded ink, was written, "Teed and Eat Summer of '92. That was the summer before I was born. I studied his face, tried to imagine what kind of man he was, what kind of father he might have been. But all I had was this image, a moment frozen in time. The next day, I packed. The funeral was over, the estate settled. There was nothing left for me in that house but echoes and shadows. As I was about to leave, my mother came to the door, holding a small box. "These were his?" she said. "Your father's. He wanted you to have them." Inside were his watches. All 5 of them. He'd worn a different one every day, depending on the day of the week. Mondays was sleek and silver. Sundays was leather and cracked. I took them without a word, because grief doesn't need language. And yet, just as I stepped into the car, a thought pierced through everything. What if the twist wasn't that I wasn't his son? What if the real twist was that I had been all along? Not by blood, but by choice, by presence, by love. Maybe being a father wasn't about origin. Maybe it was about the man who stayed, who wrote cards he couldn't sign, who kept secrets to protect me, who gave me his Sunday watch. And maybe that kind of love was worth mourning after all. I didn't drive straight home after leaving the house. Something inside me needed space. A stretch of open road and the hum of tires beneath thought. I took the long way, hours out of the way, weaving through towns I'd never heard of, down roads that wound like memory. Twisting, fading, resurfacing. I thought about the man I had called my father, about the watches now tucked in the passenger seat beside me, like quiet reminders of time he'd carried for both of us. Every tick felt louder now. And beneath it all, the silence of someone I'd never meet, a ghost named Thomas whose blood ran in me, but whose life was forever unreachable. Night fell before I found a motel on the edge of some nameless town. I didn't ask for Wi-Fi. I didn't care. I wanted disconnection. I showered, the water too hot, too cold, alternating like the emotions I couldn't quite name. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, half expecting it to speak back. And when it didn't, I reached for the watches. Monday's watch still ticked, steady and soft. It struck me then that this was the same watch he wore the day he taught me how to tie a tie. I was 11. My palms kept slipping. He never raised his voice, just kept retying until I got it. That watch had seen every Monday of my childhood. And suddenly, I realized I had more memories of him than of anyone else in my life. Not because he was loud or large, but because he was always there, present, constant, like the ticking of a watch you forget is strapped to your wrist until you stop to listen. The next morning, I drove again, this time without a destination. Somewhere along the way, I stopped at a diner. It was the kind of place that hadn't updated its menu since the 70s. The waitress called everyone "hon" and poured coffee that tasted like burnt dreams. I welcomed it. Something grounding, simple. As I sat by the window, the sky cracking open with late morning sun, I thought of Abigail. We hadn't spoken since I left. We never were the type to exchange daily texts or late-night calls. But now the silence between us felt heavier, different. I wondered if she felt the same disorientation, if her memories of childhood were unraveling like mine. Not in loss, but in redefinition. The idea that what we thought we knew wasn't wrong, just incomplete. Like reading a book with the last chapter torn out, only to find it years later, tucked behind a drawer. I drove again, eventually finding myself outside a brick building with ivy crawling up the sides. A university campus. Mine, in fact. A place I hadn't visited since graduation. I parked and walked through the quad, past the bench where I'd first kissed someone, past the dorm window I once threw up from after too much vodka and heartbreak. It felt like someone else's life. But inside, I found the library. The same quiet smell of ink and air conditioning and age. And I walked straight to the genealogy section, because if Thomas was a name, I wanted more than that. I wanted context. It wasn't hard. One database, a few keywords. Margaret Harrow's obituary from 2 years ago listed Thomas as her only child. Survived by no spouse, no children, just a line about a restless spirit and a fondness for jazz. There was a yearbook photo from his high school days. He looked like me, or I looked like him. The resemblance was undeniable, but the eyes were different. He had the look of someone already leaving. Even in stillness, he looked like motion, and I hated him for that. For disappearing, for leaving me a question mark instead of a memory. But then something odd caught my attention. A news clipping. Buried in the local archive, a man rescued from river after attempted jump. The date August 2000, I was 6. The man Thomas Harrow. It was a short article. He'd survived. No charges filed. Said it was an accident, but it wasn't. I knew it, and suddenly, I realized my entire life had been built on decisions made by broken people trying their best not to break others. George had stayed, even though I wasn't his. Evelyn had lied, thinking love could be protected by silence. Thomas had vanished, maybe because he thought he had nothing left to offer. And all of it led to me, sitting alone in a library, stitching together the ghosts of 3 lives just to understand my own. I printed the article, folded it, put it in the same envelope as the card, a growing shrine to fractured truths. As I walked out of the library, I passed a group of students laughing, alive in ways I no longer was. And I realized something I hadn't before. I envied them, not for their youth, but for their certainty, their unshaken belief in the ground beneath their feet. Because once you learn the people who raised you were actors in a play you didn't know you were part of, it becomes harder to trust the script of your own life. I returned home 3 days later. My apartment smelled like disuse. I dropped my bag, watched dust catch the light in slow motion. I should have unpacked. I should have eaten. But instead, I sat at my desk and began writing. Not a memoir, not a letter, just thoughts. Freefall. I wrote about the red notebook, the watches, the card, the funeral, the photo of Thomas and Evelyn laughing under a sun I'd never seen. I wrote about Abigail and how she'd known and chosen silence not out of malice, but protection. And I wrote about George, about how love might not always come in warmth, but in presence, in choice, in the act of staying. I wrote until my hand ached, until the sun rose, until the world outside began again. Days passed, life resumed in fragments. Work, bills, dinners alone. But something inside had shifted. One night I got a message from Abigail. It was a photo of a tree, old and crooked. "Do you remember this?" she asked. I did. We used to climb it, long before words like betrayal or genetics meant anything to us. I replied, "I do." And that was enough. Weeks later, a letter arrived in my mailbox, no return address. Inside was a photo. A man, older now, with tired eyes and salt in his hair. No note, just the image. I stared at it for a long time before I realized who it was. Thomas. Someone had taken the time to find me. To say something without words. I didn't know what to do with it. But I knew it wasn't the end, and that's when it started again. The dreams. At first they were abstract, colors, places, then faces. George smiling faintly, Evelyn holding a red notebook, Abigail standing by a tree, and then him, Thomas. Always just out of reach. Always looking back over his shoulder like he knew he wasn't supposed to stay. Like he knew I wasn't finished looking for him. And maybe I wasn't. Maybe I never would be. Because family isn't a fact. It's a story. And mine had changed. Not ended, just changed. And stories, I was learning, don't always need a clean ending. Some are meant to echo, to stretch, to bend in the places we thought were rigid. That night, I wore the Monday watch. It was Thursday, but it didn't matter. Time was strange now. I sat at the desk, lit a candle, and unfolded the card one last time. I traced the words with my finger. And I whispered, into the quiet, I hear you. I know. And maybe I forgive you. I didn't know if I meant it yet. But I wanted to. And for now, wanting was enough. I began searching for Thomas not out of anger or yearning, but out of necessity. Like a puzzle missing its corner piece, I couldn't stop seeing the shape of his absence. The letter, the photo of him older, alone and unsmiling, had left something unfinished inside me. Someone knew where he was. Someone had taken that picture. And so, I started with the only clue I had, the postmark. It was faint, smudged but legible. Upstate New York. A small town called Wren Hollow. A name I'd never heard, yet one that already felt entangled with fate. I booked a flight without telling anyone. Not Abigail, not my mother. This wasn't a trip I could explain. I didn't know what I expected to find. Answers, maybe, or just a man who shared my DNA and little else. But I had to look. I had to see for myself whether a man could vanish and still leave shadows strong enough to haunt the living. Wren Hollow was more like a suggestion than a town. One main road, a diner, a barber shop, a general store that sold everything from propane tanks to fishing lures. The trees pressed close to the streets, whispering with the wind, as if they were hiding something. I stayed at a tiny inn run by a woman named Nora who spoke softly and didn't ask questions. That first evening, I walked the length of the town twice before dusk settled like ash. I went into the diner, ordered coffee, waited, listened. Locals talked about rain, high school football, the price of gas. I waited for someone to say his name. No one did. On my second day, I visited the library. It was smaller than the one my mother had worked in, but smelled exactly the same. Dust, ink, the quiet dignity of old words. I asked the librarian if there was a local archive. She pointed me toward a back room that doubled as a history closet. That's where I found a slim file marked Harrow, T. One newspaper clipping. A single article from 2 years ago. A man matching Thomas's description had been arrested for trespassing on a private dock after midnight. No charges filed, but there was a note in the margins. Known transient. Resides off Route 12 in Miller's Cabin. The librarian didn't question me when I asked where Route 12 was. Maybe she'd seen this kind of search before. Maybe in towns like these, strangers always arrived looking for ghosts. Miller's Cabin wasn't a cabin at all. It was a crumbling house at the edge of a frozen lake, shielded by pine and thyme. The front porch sagged like a tired sigh. I hesitated before stepping up. There were no signs of life. No car, no movement, no sound. But the door was slightly ajar, knocked anyway. Nothing. I pushed it open. Inside was a museum of isolation. Stacks of books. A cot. Empty bottles. A stove that hadn't been lit in weeks. And in the corner an old camera. Film still inside. The place was abandoned. Not long, but long enough. Whoever had lived there had left in a hurry, or simply stopped caring. I should have turned around. I should have let the silence win. But instead, I sat down at the small wooden desk, covered in old receipts and half-filled notebooks. The handwriting was unmistakable. One entry read, "Saw a boy today who looked like me." Wasn't him? Can't be. But for a second, I almost believed it. Another said, Dreamed of Evelyn. Her laugh like glass breaking, woke up shaking. Page after page of half-thoughts, regrets, broken syntax. This was a man unraveling slowly. Not in a blaze, but in a whisper. A life dimming from the inside. I took one notebook, left the rest. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to steal his ghosts. Maybe I thought if he returned, he'd need them. I drove back into town that evening, shaken. At the diner, I asked the waitress, Jenny, if she knew him. I showed her the photo. She stared for a long time before nodding. He came in sometimes. Always sat at the corner booth. Ordered coffee black. Didn't talk much. Wrote a lot. People said he used to be a teacher, or maybe a musician. He never said. I asked when she last saw him. A few weeks ago, she said. He left in the middle of the night. Just vanished. Like he was never real. I asked if anyone might know where he went. She looked at me long and hard. Why are you looking for him? She asked. I didn't lie. I said, he might be my father. Her face softened. I hope you find what you need, she said, and walked away. I stayed 3 more days. Each morning, I drove out to the cabin, sat on the porch, waited. He never came. On the last day, I walked around the lake. There was a trail barely visible, winding into the trees. I followed it, found a clearing with a view of the water and a pile of stones stacked like a monument. No markings, just wait. I sat beside it for hours. Thought about the man I'd never meet. A man who ran not out of malice, but fear. A man who wrote my mother's name like a prayer and a curse. And I realized then that some absences become part of your DNA. That not all fathers are meant to be found. Some are only meant to be understood. When I returned home, I felt older. Not in years, but in distance. Like something inside had closed. Not locked, just done. I called Abigail that night. Told her everything. She listened, didn't speak for a long time, then said, I think he wanted you to find that photo. I think he wanted to be seen, even if he couldn't face you. I didn't know if that made things better or worse, but it felt true. She asked if I was okay. I said yes. It was a lie, but not a cruel one. A week later, I received another envelope. No note, just a photograph. Me standing outside the cabin. The angle was distant from the woods. I didn't know if it meant he was still watching. If he'd seen me leave. If he was still out there, moving through the world like vapor. But I knew this. I was no longer chasing him. I had found enough. I had seen enough. The story wasn't whole, but it was mine now. And with that came a strange peace. I wore his watch every Monday. George's, not Thomas's. I still called him Dad in my thoughts. I still remembered the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. The way he folded his napkin after every meal. I kept his last card in my wallet, folded, faded. But there, a tether to the man who stayed, not the one who fled. Blood had brought me questions. Love had raised me. And in the quiet between those truths, I finally found something like clarity. One evening, I visited my mother. She looked older, smaller somehow, like time had caught up all at once. I sat at the table where she used to cut my sandwiches into triangles. I asked her if she remembered the cabin. She didn't speak, just nodded. He wrote about you, I said. He dreamed of you. Her hands trembled. I know, she whispered. I asked if she ever loved him. She smiled sadly. I loved who he was in that moment. But moments don't last. I asked if she regretted it. She looked at me, her eyes soft. No, because he gave me you. And even though I didn't do everything right, you're still the best thing I ever had. For the first time in a long time, I believed her. That night, I stood outside the house and looked up at the window that used to be mine. I thought about all the things I would never know, about Thomas wandering still, about George silent in his grave, about my mother carrying both guilt and grace. And I thought about myself, the boy I'd been, the man I was becoming, not defined by secrets, but shaped by them. And somewhere in the distance, I imagined the sound of a camera shutter. One last click, one final frame, not to capture a ghost, but to prove I had survived him. I didn't expect to hear from him again. After the photo of me outside the cabin arrived, I assumed that was his final word, a silent nod across the trees, a snapshot instead of a sentence. I tucked the image in the same envelope as the others. The card, the newspaper clipping, the printout from the library. I'd started calling it the archive, as if naming it gave it shape, order, containment. But then, just when the dust began to settle, another letter came. No return address, just my name written in a hand I now recognized without doubt. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting more rushed this time, less careful, as if written in motion. If you're still looking, stop. Some things stay broken for a reason. But if you need to know why, come to where it started. October 17. Noon. There's only one bridge in Greystone. You'll find the rest. Greystone. Another town. Another name spoken like a riddle. I looked it up. Small. Remote. A former mining town 2 states away. The kind of place that barely made the map. October 17 was 3 days away. I didn't hesitate. I packed a bag, filled the gas tank, and set out before sunrise. I didn't tell Abigail. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't want the weight of their expectations. I needed to go alone. The road to Greystone felt like falling backward through time. The trees grew thicker, the air colder, the radio fading into static. I passed shuttered factories, rusted playgrounds, motels with flickering signs. The town itself emerged like a memory. Faded, quiet, watchful. A single gas station. A diner that hadn't changed its menu since the 80s. And just beyond the town's edge, a bridge, metal. Narrow. Spanning a shallow gorge over a dry river. It looked like the kind of place people went to forget things. Or leave them behind. I arrived early, parked a distance away, walked the last stretch on foot. The bridge groaned under my steps. Wind pushed through the rails like breath. Noon came. Then 10 minutes. Then 20. I thought maybe it was a trick, a way to say goodbye without being seen. But then, a figure emerged on the far side. He looked older than the last photo. Gaunter, worn thin by whatever road he'd walked to get here. But it was him. Thomas, my father, if that word still meant anything. He stopped halfway across. So did I. 10 feet apart. A silence heavier than any conversation. I didn't think you'd come, he said at last. His voice was rough, like it hadn't been used in years. I wasn't sure I should. He nodded, as if that made sense. You look like her, he said. But not just her. You have my walk. I didn't respond. I didn't know how. He looked past me, toward the trees. I used to come here when I was a kid. Before everything. Before I knew how to disappear. Why? I asked. He took a breath. Because it was quiet. Because I could pretend I didn't exist. Back then, I thought invisibility was peace. And now? He looked at me then. Really looked. No, I know it's just another kind of prison. The wind shifted. A bird shrieked somewhere overhead. I got your letters, I said. The photo. He smiled faintly. I didn't know if I should send them. Didn't know if I had the right. You didn't, I said. But I'm glad you did. That surprised him. He blinked, looked away. I wasn't trying to be a father I didn't think I could be. I wasn't there. I was lost. Still am, maybe. I know, I said. But you mattered, even in your absence. He flinched, like I'd struck something soft. I thought leaving was the kindest thing. I didn't want to be a shadow over your life. But you were, I said. Just not the way you thought. He lowered his head. I'm sorry. The words were small, but they carried weight, and they fell into the space between us like stones in water. We stood there for a while, neither speaking. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn envelope. I wrote this for you, back when you were born. I didn't send it. I didn't trust myself, but it's yours. I took it. It felt fragile. Light. Inside was a letter written on lined notebook paper, faded with time. I didn't read it then. I just held it. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. I just wanted you to see me, once, before I go. Where are you going? He looked at the sky, then at the trees. Does it matter? It did, but I didn't say so. He started to turn. Wait, I said. Do you ever think about what could have been? If you'd stayed? All the time, he said. But regrets don't raise children. George did that. He was the real father. Was? And then he was gone. Down the path, into the trees, swallowed like a secret. I didn't follow. I stayed on the bridge, listened to the creak of the metal, the wind, my breath. That night, in a cheap motel outside Greystone, I opened the envelope. The letter was written in tight script. No salutation, no sign off. You were never a mistake. You were the only thing I ever did right. I was afraid of that. Afraid of loving something I couldn't keep, so I ran. It was cowardice, not mercy. I told myself leaving spared you pain. But I see now I only shifted the burden. I see you in dreams. I imagine your voice. I wonder if you laugh like I did, or if you're more like her. If you're reading this, it means I've failed again, by not being there to tell you in person. But know this, you are loved. Not perfectly, not well, but deeply, forever. I folded the letter, placed it in the archive, and cried, not out of grief, but out of release. Out of finally knowing the shape of the absence that had followed me like a shadow. The next morning, I drove home. The road felt different now, like I was bringing something back I hadn't known I was missing. When I got back, I called Abigail. I told her everything. She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "You met him. After all these years." I did. "Do you feel better?" "No, but I feel finished." She understood. I didn't need to explain. Later that week, I visited George's grave. I brought the watches. All of them. I laid them out on the grass, Monday through Sunday. His legacy in 7 ticking pieces. "I met him," I said aloud. "The man who gave me your burden, the man you turned into love." The wind shifted. The grass whispered, "I'm sorry I doubted you. Sorry I ever thought blood could mean more than the time you gave me." I took the Sunday watch, wound it, placed it back in my pocket. The rest I left behind, and as I walked away I felt it, not peace, but permission to move on, to start again. I thought the story had ended. I had met him, Thomas, and seen with my own eyes the hollow shape he had become. I had returned to George's grave, spoken words I never could when he was alive. I had even begun to unpack the archive, page by page, memory by memory, turning them over like bones, naming each for what it truly was. But stories don't end when we think they do. They wait. They watch. And sometimes they whisper one last secret when you're just beginning to breathe again. It started with a phone call from Abigail. She never called twice in a row. We were text people, email people. But this time, 2 missed calls, then a voicemail that started with my name. Just my name, and ended with 4 words that knocked the air from my lungs. "You need to come." It was the house again. Our house. The one we'd grown up in. The one now empty of parents, full only of echo and the scent of dust. She didn't explain on the phone. Just said she found something while going through the attic again, cleaning out the last few boxes neither of us had been ready to face. I drove through the night. The highway was black and endless, the kind of road where you forget which direction you're going until a sign reminds you. I arrived just after sunrise, the sky cracking open with dull light. Abigail was waiting on the porch. She looked older since the last time I'd seen her, like she'd been spending time with ghosts. She didn't smile, just opened the door and led me inside. The house was stripped now. No furniture, no framed photos, just bare walls and the sound of our footsteps. "In the attic," she said, under the floorboards. We climbed the narrow stairs in silence. The attic had always been a place of forgotten things. Boxes of holiday decorations, my childhood science fair projects, Dad's old golf clubs. But now the far corner had been cleared, revealing wooden floorboards pulled back to expose a hidden compartment. Abigail knelt and reached inside, pulling out a metal box. Heavy, old, the kind with a clasp and no lock, as if the contents had only ever been hidden from us, not the world. She handed it to me without a word. My hands shook. I opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, yellowed with time, some bound with twine, others loose, all addressed to one name, Evelyn, my mother. The handwriting wasn't gorgeous, and it wasn't Thomas's. I took the top one, dated March 1991, long before I was born, before Abigail even. The ink was faded, but still legible. "Evelyn, I don't expect you to write back. I just need to say this once. What we had was real, even if it was brief. You made me feel seen. If I had been stronger, maybe I would have stayed. But I'm not him. I can't be what he is. I'm not ready for that kind of life. But I loved you even if I left. I want you to know that. I read the name at the bottom. Daniel, not Thomas. I looked at Abigail. She was pale but calm. "There are more?" she said. I read a few, enough to know. We sat there for hours, reading letter after letter. They were from a man my mother had met before Thomas, before George even entered her life. A man she'd never spoken of. A man she loved. And then one letter in particular, dated June 1994. "Evelyn, I can't stop thinking about you. About the boy. About whether he's mine. I keep replaying that night in my head, wondering if I should come forward. But I see how happy you are with George. You've built something good. Stable, I won't destroy that. I won't ask questions. Just promise me one thing. If he ever asks, tell him I loved him, even if from a distance, even if it wasn't safe to stay." The boy. Me. I dropped the letter. My vision blurred. My ears buzzed with blood. Not Thomas. Daniel. A third man. A third possibility. "I don't understand," I said. "Mom told me it was Thomas." Abigail shook her head. Maybe she believed it. Maybe she wanted to believe it. But she never told us the whole truth. I found an envelope buried in the same box. It had your name on it. She handed it to me. The seal was broken, the paper inside crinkled with age. My name, scrawled in familiar handwriting, my mother's, sat at the top. "My son, if you're reading this, it means I didn't find the courage to tell you myself. You'll have questions about who you are, where you came from. And the truth is, I don't fully know. There were mistakes, moments I can't erase. There was Thomas, and there was Daniel. But I chose George because he was steady, because he offered you a name, a home, a father. I didn't know which man was your biological father. I didn't take the test. I didn't want it to matter. You were mine. And that was when I read it twice. 3 times. My hands numb. My heartbeat erratic. There was no answer. There never had been. The man I'd believed was my father wasn't. Then the man I'd been told replaced him. Thomas wasn't either. Daniel, possibly. Or maybe someone else. Someone forgotten in the fog of time and memory. The truth had dissolved beneath layers of silence and assumption. I stood, walked to the window. The sky outside was bruised, overcast. I saw the tree we used to climb, now bare, skeletal. "What do we do?" I asked. Abigail didn't answer at first. Then she said, "I think we live." The words were simple, too simple. But in that moment, they felt right. That evening, we burned the letters. Not all of them. Some I kept, the ones that felt like pieces of a soul. But most. We did it in the fireplace downstairs, the one George used to light every Christmas. The flames devoured the paper quickly, curling words into ash, smoke into air. I felt no relief, only release, and that night I dreamed, not of Thomas, not of Daniel, but as my child, running through the yard. No shadows, no name, just motion, just joy, just being. When I woke, I knew what I had to do. I returned to the attic the next morning, closed the box, nailed the floorboards back into place, let the house breathe again. Then I wrote letters of my own. To Abigail, I wrote, "Thank you for not turning away when the truth became unbearable, for standing beside me in the wreckage, for being my sister, no matter what." To my mother, I wrote, "I forgive you, not because I understand, but because I choose peace over permanence. You loved me the best way you knew how. That was never nothing." But to George, I wrote, "You were never my blood, but you were my home, and that matters more than any lineage ever could. I hope you knew that, even when I didn't." And to myself, I wrote, "You are not the sum of other people's choices. You are not defined by names you never knew, by love that came and went. You are whole, because you endured, because you stayed, because you kept looking until you found something worth keeping." I sealed each letter and placed them in the archive. Then I tucked the archive into a drawer and closed it, not with the weight of finality, but with the ease of one chapter ending and another ready to begin. Years have passed since then. I live in a new city now, one with unfamiliar streets and windows that catch the sun differently. I teach. I write. Sometimes I walk past a stranger who looks like George, or Thomas, or even Daniel. Sometimes I wonder if I carry pieces of all three. Maybe I do. Maybe we all carry the echoes of others. But I don't chase them anymore. I still have the watches, Monday through Saturday, tucked away. I wear the Sunday watch often, not out of nostalgia, but because it reminds me that time isn't a loop. It's a thread, frayed, tangled, but always moving forward. And every year on my birthday, I read the card again. Proud of you. Dad, I still don't know who wrote it, but I believe it now. And that's enough. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe and like the video.